Dear listeners, you've returned once more. How delightful. But tell me, why aren't you in bed? Perhaps you should be. Because tonight, sleep will not come easy. Tonight, we serve up 3 late-night horrors, stories woven from the fabric of fear itself, laced with shadows, dripping with dread. Will you dare to listen? Will you endure the whispers in the dark? Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Dr. Sinister's Tales of Terror. Now let us begin. The moon hung low, a sickly yellow eye in the ink-black sky, casting long, wavering shadows over the town. The buildings, weathered and silent, crouched like forgotten relics of a past no one spoke of. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on most maps, where whispers replaced conversation and strangers were met with averted gazes. The air itself seemed heavier here, thick with something unseen but felt in the bones. The documentary crew had arrived with cameras and notepads, eager to pull back the curtain on the town's dark history. Missing children, strange disappearances, whispers of something lurking just beyond the reach of logic. It was the kind of story that begged to be told, the kind that gnawed at curiosity like an itch that couldn't be scratched. They should have left the moment they got there. Instead, they ignored the stiff backs and wary eyes of the townsfolk, dismissing the glassy stares as backwoods paranoia. The first day passed in fruitless attempts at interviews, each door they knocked on closing before they could finish introducing themselves. The few who did speak gave only curt responses, no comment, or best if you leave. Even the children, usually drawn to cameras like moths to light, stayed hidden, peeking through lace curtains before vanishing into the gloom. That night, they went to the local bar, hoping for a lead. The moment they stepped inside, the noise died. Conversation halted, glasses froze midair, and every head turned to face them. The bartender, a wiry man with a face like a weathered tombstone, polished a glass in slow, deliberate circles. When Robert, ever the spokesperson, attempted to buy drinks and ask questions, the bartender set the glass down with a quiet finality. "You should leave," he said. His voice was devoid of emotion, flat as a church hymn sung too many times. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Later, when they returned to their rented cabin, a sharp knock broke the uneasy silence. 3 steady raps, deliberate, measured. Daniel hesitated before opening the door. Standing there, bathed in the glow of the weak porch light, was an old man. His face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, his eyes twin wells of exhaustion. "Leave," he said, voice like rust scraping against stone. "Why?" Alice asked, stepping forward. "What's going on here?" The old man merely shook his head. "They've already chosen you." And then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness without another word. The next morning, their unease had faded, replaced with stubborn resolve. They ventured deeper into town, seeking answers. The town, however, remained unchanged, silent, secretive, unyielding. As dusk settled over the land, the townsfolk came. The sound started as a low murmur, voices blending together in a chant that had no melody, but somehow still made their skin crawl. The townsfolk stood in a perfect circle around the cabin, their breath misting in the cold air. Their eyes, those awful, empty eyes, never blinked. Then, the flames started. At first, it was a small glow in the distance, a flickering orange against the darkness. Then, the glow spread, the fire licking higher, consuming the vehicle they had parked outside the cabin. Robert sprinted toward it, but the heat drove him back. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled the air. "They're burning our way out," Alice screamed, her voice edged with panic. The fire crackled, illuminating the impassive faces of the townsfolk. No one moved, no one spoke. They only watched as the flames devoured the last hope of escape. "Jesus Christ," Daniel whispered. He backed away from the window, his breathing quick and shallow. "They're just standing there." Alice swallowed hard. "We should call the cops." Robert, ever the practical one, held up his phone. No service. Claire, the youngest, clutched her camera to her chest, like a talisman. "Maybe we can talk to them," she suggested. "Get some footage. Show the world what's happening here." Daniel gave a humorless laugh. "Yeah? And what do we do when they decide to show us instead?" A pounding at the door cut the conversation short. 3 heavy knocks, deep and deliberate. The doorknob rattled. Then the knocking came again, 3 beats, like a slow, methodical drum. "You must leave." The old man's voice was barely more than a rasp. Alice rushed to the door, throwing it open. "Why? What the hell is going on here?" The old man's eyes darted behind him. The townsfolk remained motionless, waiting. "They've already chosen you. They've been waiting a long time." A gust of wind howled through the trees, carrying a sound with it. A child's laughter, high and eerie, like wind chimes made of bone. And then they saw them. Pale figures stepped out from between the townsfolk, small hands curling into claws, tiny faces grinning with too many teeth. Their eyes were black voids, hungry and endless. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like marionettes with invisible strings. "Oh, God," Claire whimpered. "The children." The old man turned and fled, leaving them to their fate. The townsfolk advanced, slow and deliberate. The children did not wait. They ran, their movements impossibly fast, their fingers stretching longer, sharper. The cabin was no fortress. The windows shattered, sending jagged shards raining down. Cold, tiny hands grasped at them, yanking, pulling. Daniel was the first to go, dragged screaming through the broken window, his cries cut off with a sickening snap. Alice swung a fire poker wildly, knocking one of the children away. Its head twisted at an unnatural angle, but it did not fall. It did not stop. Robert grabbed Claire's wrist. "We have to run." They tore out the back door, plunging into the darkness of the forest. The trees loomed high, skeletal fingers against the night sky. The laughter followed them, close, so damn close. They didn't stop running until their lungs burned, until their legs screamed in protest. When they finally collapsed, gasping, the town was nowhere in sight. Just trees, endless trees, and silence. "Did we lose them?" Claire asked, voice shaking. Robert was about to answer when he heard it. A soft giggle just behind him. The last thing he saw were the black eyes of a child, and the last thing he felt was the sharp pierce of tiny fingers burrowing deep into his throat. By morning, the town was as it had been before. Quiet. Empty. The sun rose over the cabins, the bar, the empty streets, and in the bar, 5 new figures sat at a table, their eyes glassy, their faces frozen in eerie smiles. The town never let anyone leave. It simply welcomed them home. Cheyenne. Wyoming had its fair share of stories. Urban legends that had been whispered through generations. Tales of things that lurked just outside the veil of the ordinary. And at the heart of one of the town's most unsettling legends was the old woman who lived in the house at the end of Maple Street. Her home was an eyesore in an otherwise modest neighborhood. Its once white paint peeling like dead skin, its front yard overgrown with weeds that seemed to grasp at any passerby. Her windows were perpetually dark, save for the occasional flickering candle. No one in town could remember the last time the house had been well maintained, nor could they recall seeing the old woman during the day. She was known only as Miss Wilkins, the seamstress, but the stories about her were far more sinister. Parents spoke in hushed voices about the warnings they'd heard growing up. How Miss Wilkins wasn't just an old woman, but a witch who had lived far longer than any human should. She had a taste for children, they said, especially the disobedient ones. If a child used foul language or disrespected their parents, Miss Wilkins would take them in the dead of night and stitch their lips shut, leaving them to wander in eternal silence. Some said they could still hear the cries of the children she had taken, muffled and desperate, echoing from her cellar at night. Lisa Thompson, a woman in her early 40s, had never given much thought to the old stories. She and her husband, Mark, had lived in the neighborhood for years, raising their son, Jason, now 12. The house on Maple Street had always been a curiosity to Jason and his friends. But to Lisa, it was just another relic of old Cheyenne. Jason and his friends, however, had no fear. They laughed at the idea that an ancient seamstress could be a threat and took every opportunity to antagonize Miss Wilkins. They called her names, threw rocks at her house, and sometimes, when their courage was high, crept onto her porch, daring each other to knock on her door. One cold autumn evening, their taunts went too far. Miss Wilkins emerged from the shadows of her house, her bony fingers clutching the frame of her door as she stepped onto her decayed porch. Jason and his friends froze, suddenly aware that the darkness had swallowed them, leaving them alone with the legend. Her face, hidden beneath the hood of a tattered cloak, twisted and stretched unnaturally, her eyes sinking into her skull as her mouth pulled into a jagged, malicious grin. The boys screamed and ran, their courage turning to dust as they scrambled away. Jason had never run so fast in his life, his heart hammering against his ribs, when he burst through the front door of his house, gasping for breath. Lisa and Mark barely had time to react before he blurted out the story. Lisa exchanged a glance with Mark, unimpressed. "Jason, honey, you know better than to harass an old woman." "She's a witch, Mom, I swear. Her face, it changed. It wasn't human." Mark sighed, shaking his head. "I'll talk to her in the morning. You kids are lucky she didn't call the cops on you." Just then, the phone rang. Lisa answered, and on the other end was Sarah Miller, another mother from the neighborhood. Her voice trembled. "Lisa, my son just came home. He saw the same thing Jason did. He's terrified. What if it's true? What if—" Lisa hung up, her hands shaking. Mark frowned, considering. "I'll go now." "Mark, no," Lisa whispered. "Let it go. It's just some weird old woman." But Mark was already grabbing his coat, ready to pay Miss Wilkins a visit. "I'll just talk to her." Lisa waited an hour, then another. Her worry grew with each passing minute. Finally, just as she was reaching for her phone, a hard knock rattled the front door. She ran to it, her breath caught in her throat. When she opened it, Mark stood there, swaying, his hands trembling. His eyes were wide with terror, and his mouth was sewn shut. Lisa screamed. Mark staggered inside, his muffled cries turning into desperate grunts. Blood trickled down his chin, and his hands clawed at the crude black stitches holding his lips together. And then she heard it. Laughter. Miss Wilkins stood at the end of the driveway, grinning beneath the moonlight. Her skeletal fingers flexed, her eyes gleaming with wicked delight. Lisa slammed the door shut and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. As she pressed the phone to her ear, something caught her eye. Jason's bedroom door was open, his bed was empty, and the front door was ajar. Lisa turned back to the window, her breath catching in her throat. Miss Wilkins was gone. So was Jason. Victor stood at the edge of the lake, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The moon cast a sickly glow over the still black water, its surface thick with an oily sheen. The place had been deemed a biohazard years ago, contaminated from old oil deposits that had seeped up from the earth, poisoning everything in its reach. Greg's body floated limply just beneath the surface, his eyes lifeless, his skin already beginning to take on an unnatural pallor. Victor gritted his teeth and shoved him further into the sludge, watching as the body slipped beneath the black muck, disappearing into the toxic depths. A bubble rose to the surface, then another, before silence reclaimed the night. It was done. Victor exhaled sharply and turned away, wiping his hands on his jeans as if that could rid them of the crime he had just committed. He thought of Rachel and the beautiful new home they would buy with Greg's life insurance money. They were free now, free to start again. But something was wrong. It started with the noises. At first it was just the house settling. At least that's what Rachel told herself. A faint dripping sound in the hall when there were no leaks, the occasional rustling in the walls. Then there was the smell. A thick, putrid odor that clung to the air like decay, left too long in the sun. It came and went, but no matter how much she scrubbed, aired out the house, or lit candles, it always returned. Then she noticed the stain. High on the ceiling in the bedroom, an inky black smudge had formed. Rachel frowned, standing on a chair and reaching up with a rag. She scrubbed until her arms ached, through the dark smear fading into nothing. But as she climbed down and looked back up, she swore it was still there, a faint outline lurking just beyond her vision. Days passed, but the stain returned, bigger, darker, and now the odor was worse. A cloying mix of stagnant water, rotting fish, and something she couldn't place, something sickly sweet, the smell of something long dead. Victor noticed it too. He wrinkled his nose whenever he entered the bedroom, his eyes flicking toward the darkening stain. "We should call someone," he suggested one night, rubbing his hands along his arms as if the room had suddenly become cold. "A professional, maybe? A mold specialist?" Rachel shook her head. "It's just a stain. I'll clean it again." She did. That night, she woke to Victor's screams. Rachel bolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was filled with a suffocating dampness, the air thick and humid like the depths of a swamp. A low gurgling sound echoed through the space, and her stomach clenched. She turned her head and saw Victor. He was pinned against the wall, his body halfway submerged in the now glistening, writhing mass of black sludge. His hands clawed at the air, his face twisted in sheer, unbridled terror. His legs had already disappeared into the churning darkness, and the foul, bubbling tar was pulling him deeper with each second. Rachel gasped, stumbling backward, but her eyes were locked onto something else, something moving inside the sludge. Greg, his face, bloated, pale and furious, emerged from the undulating blackness. His eyes, milky and unseeing, locked onto hers. His mouth twisted into a grin, lips peeling back to reveal bloated gums and teeth stained black with oil. His hair, once neatly kept, was now slicked down with water and slime, clumps falling from his skull like decayed seaweed. His body, slick with water and thick patches of sludge, pushed forward as Victor's screams became strangled gurgles. The sludge churned, consuming her lover piece by piece, until only his outstretched hands remained, fingers twitching before they, too, vanished into the black abyss. Rachel was frozen in horror. Her breath caught in her throat. The stench was overwhelming, sour, fetid, and heavy with something ancient and wrong. Greg stepped onto the bedroom floor, water pooling at his feet. The shadows twisted around him as his bloated hand reached for her. Rachel opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was lost in the suffocating blackness. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was Greg's twisted, vengeful grin.